I'm going to talk about logistics today, specifically about how the implementation of logistics in the operation of globalized capitalism has transformed the spatial organization of production and circulation, and how this has created a unique set of vulnerabilities that has been exposed and exacerbated by the outbreak of COVID-19. And in the second half of the talk, I will analyze two predominant political trajectories that have emerged as an attempt to manage the current crisis. So what the past weeks have demonstrated is that no matter how vigilantly we social distance, how discreetly we self-isolate in our homes if we have the privilege to do so, we ultimately cannot isolate ourselves from the global circuits of supply chain capitalism. We are intricately embedded in a global network of production and circulation, as well as reliant on a multiplicity of labor involved in keeping these networks running. The implications of the logistical management of these commodity chains play a crucial but arguably often unacknowledged role in the emergence of highly unequal and precarious landscapes of labor. As supply chains are breaking down, a glance at the principles of logistical techniques offers an insight into how the current pandemic is being governed and at whose expense. So supply chain logistics have become the defining factor in the spatiality and temporality of present-day capitalism. They dictate how time, space, and human labor are mobilized, and they have engendered a sprawling and highly opaque apparatus of accumulation. Up until the 1970s, though, single-site mass production was the dominant mode. So goods would be primarily produced at one firm. The cargo was then packaged for transport in various different kinds of containers in different kinds of ways, and had to be manually loaded and unloaded by dock workers. At this point, logistical strategies remained within the realm of warfare, as logistics is originally a military science tasked with the seemingly banal duty of ensuring the efficient transport of supplies and military personnel to the front line. Then around the 1970s, it became increasingly adapted as a corporate strategy, pushed forward by the yet again seemingly trivial innovation of containerization. The advent of the standardized shipping container, built to be compatible for transport via train, ship, or truck, enabled for the first time intermodal freight transport. What was so revolutionary about the seemingly mundane development of standardized shipping containers was that it introduced the principle of modularity. This rapidly dropped the price of transport, which not only accelerated circulation, but paved the way for the unfolding of neoliberal globalization, as the new hypermobility of capital enabled the further utilization of the unevenness of economic geographies, making resources and cheap human labor available to capital on a planetary scale. The move towards organizing production across space is a development that has been anticipated in the early writings of Marx in the Grundrisse, where he had argued that the further capitalism develops, the more likely it is that circulation becomes integrated into the production process. So he argues here that, quote, capital by its nature drives beyond every spatial barrier. Thus, the creation of the physical conditions of exchange, of the means of communication and transport, the annihilation of space by time, becomes an extraordinary necessity for it. End quote. This assertion that capitalism leads to an annihilation of space by time speaks to capitalism's inherently expansive tendency, as production, distribution, and consumption spread across increasingly dispersed global spaces. In order to mobilize time and space most extractively, capital will strive to eliminate all spatial and temporal boundaries of circulation. And this is precisely where logistics enters the game, and it is exactly what makes its implementation so profitable for capital and so detrimental for labor. We see the ascent of corporate logistics reflected in the increasing integration of nodes of physical transport infrastructure, so ports, railways, highways, bridges, entire logistical hubs, often strategically located near large urban metropolitan areas, and internet-based inventory information systems, which utilize the instantaneous data processing capacities of digital technology for tracking systems to monitor orders, production, delivery, as well as using that information for predictive data analyses, all of which the system is highly reliant on. And this was all necessary to make the transition to what David Harvey has termed flexible accumulation, which he defines as follows. Flexible accumulation is marked by a direct confrontation with the rigidities of Fordism. It rests on a flexibility with respect to labor processes, labor markets, products, and patterns of consumption. It is characterized by the emergence of entirely new sectors of production, new ways of providing financial services, new markets, and above all, greatly intensified rates of commercial, technological, and organizational innovation. So as defined here, flexible accumulation is the ordained execution of a demand-driven economy. And it thereby tackles and regulates one of the core contradictions of capitalism, and that's overproduction. So by seeking to synchronize supply and demand, flexible accumulation enables capital to respond with ever greater flexibility to the volatility of the market. Rather than producing X amount of goods and having those sit in the retailer's inventory up until they were sold, as in the Fordist model, production is now shifted towards a demand-driven system where capital can keep circulating just in time rather than sitting idly in a warehouse. Resources and finished goods, once considered valuable, are now regarded as an idle dead investment. The competitive advantage derived thus hinges on finely calibrated and highly integrated production and circulation models, which have only gained importance as time-based competition increased further with the rising prominence of e-commerce. The strategic aspect of logistics thus stems from, as geographer Deborah Cohen has put it, the shift from cost minimization after production to value added across circulatory systems. So in order to extract value across circulatory systems, companies rely on the smooth operation of large logistical hubs where transport, warehousing, and intermodal facilities collide. Advances in automation aside, it requires large swaths of workers to keep these logistical hubs running. It speaks to the inherently contradictory nature of capitalism, that through the implementation of logistical techniques, we are witnessing a new patterning of massive regional concentrations of manual human labor, which is precisely what capital had intended to decouple itself from in the first place. The specter of the inevitable threat of machine competition is not only determinist, it's also routinely overblown and highly ideological, as it is frequently employed as a disciplining strategy to depress wages. After all, the myth of human obsolescence due to the integration of novel technologies is as old as industrialized capitalism itself. We are presently at the height of automation, and yet globally, the share of the human population subsumed into the relations of wage labor has never been larger. Despite high levels of technological sophistication, the movement of goods within the just-in-time framework is anything but fully automated. Due to the critical position of logistics workers employed along the commodity chain in port stocks, warehouses, highways, railways, and distribution centers, they should, in theory, have strong leveraging power due to the economic significance of this sector. In order to understand the contextual parameters that keep this potential power in check, I'm going to briefly revert back to what Harvey has pointed out about flexible accumulation, and that's that besides the shift from the rigidities of Fordism to the adaptability of post-Fordism, is the flexibility of labor relations. So similarly to resources, human labor is sought to be managed on a flexible, on-demand basis, which turns corporations into increasingly unaccountable actors. This flexibilization of labor was enabled by a deregulatory restructuring of the labor market, which allows market actors to dynamically respond to fluctuations and adjust the size of their workforce accordingly. The trucking industry has in many ways epitomized the logistics-focused shift of flexible accumulation, and it is a sector that has been hit especially hard by labor deregulation. The steady erosion of labor standards turned what used to be one of the most secure blue-collar jobs to an industry described as sweatshops on wheels. Business has long been lamenting that last-mile delivery in particular is among the most time-intensive and most cost-intensive steps in the distribution of goods. For that very reason, employment models of the gig economy, part-time work, and subcontracting run rampant in this sector, as they allow corporate actors to effectively offload market risk as well as all of the responsibilities that employers traditionally have towards a permanently employed staff onto their contingently employed workforce. Again, Amazon proves to be at the forefront of this development. In order to drive down costs, the company has over the past years drastically scaled down its dependency on established logistics service providers like FedEx or UPS and their largely unionized workforce, and instead established an opaque network of subcontracted delivery drivers as well as independent contractors who signed up for their gig work app Flex, where individuals can offer to transport parcels in their private vehicle. While the company advertises the flexible hours of the job and the opportunity to quote-unquote be your own boss, in actuality, this arrangement simply allows Amazon to bypass any of the financial responsibilities that they would have to grant a permanently employed and unionized delivery staff. And unlike other established logistic firms, the company's subcontracted delivery network in the US is also not regulated by the FMCSA, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, due to the fact that the cargo vans that Amazon employs are just small enough to not be regulated under federal law. And this allows the company to also shirk responsibility for the safety of their drivers, even in case of accidents which are not registered in the federal records. The strategy of employing high numbers of agency workers and independent contractors not only erodes labor standards in this sector, but it also makes these workers notoriously difficult to organize, as this tactic not only leads to a high turnover rate among the staff, but also creates rifts and fractures between permanently employed and the subcontracted, which effectively fragments and atomizes the workforce. This aspect of repression is crucial within the perspective of logistics, as labor action and pushback by workers present a potential stumbling block in the smooth circulation of capital. The anti-labor developments in this sector testify to the desire to make the entire operation as frictionless as possible. Weak labor laws then enable corporate actors to target unionization efforts more aggressively, as for instance, the actions of Amazon have shown in the past weeks when the company disciplined labor action by firing key organizers, as well as famously tracking the unionization risk of the recently acquired grocery chain Whole Foods with a data-driven heat map. While companies like Amazon may be particularly effective in exploiting gaps in labor protection, it is crucial to recognize that these precarious conditions have been facilitated by state-led deregulation, which renders workers increasingly vulnerable to the extractive force of capital. As lucrative as the finely calibrated supply chains of just-in-time capitalism may be, this ascending protocol and the spatio-temporal organization of production and distribution has however also proven to be incredibly vulnerable. The supply chains of the on-demand economy are highly time-sensitive and they're geographically overstretched, a disposition that proves to be lacking resilience under the current predicament. The system is fragile and highly vulnerable to exogenous shocks and disruptions due to its high levels of internal interdependency, and the current pandemic has shed a harsh light on the pathologies of its underlying rationale. The system fails due to its reliance on overly expanded and accurately calculated commodity chains, whose hyper-rationalized management does not permit any buffers or reserve capacities, leaving the system unprepared to handle disruption. The outbreak of COVID-19 has been a painful reminder of the fact that no matter how rigidly surveilled, how carefully calculated, and how technologically advanced the logistical management of labor and resources gets, disruption is a very real possibility, and it is once again confirmed that the vision of total control and of uninterrupted, seamlessly flowing commodity chains remains to be an illusion fueled by capitalist hubris far removed from reality. As supply chains are breaking down, the current shortages of N95 respirator masks serve as a textbook example of the very existential limits of unconstrained free markets and the devastating effects of the dictate of producing just enough right when it is needed. Despite all the talk about the exceptional interconnectedness and the scattered dispersion of the just-in-time model, it has actually produced highly concentrated regional clusters of production and distribution alike. We see this, for instance, in the case of China, which has emerged as the global center of outsourced manufacturing. To cut costs, major producers of personal protection equipment have offshored production to China, where presently an estimate of 85% of the world's respirator masks are manufactured. As the N95 mask was for long not necessarily considered a strategic commodity, mask manufacturers are now struggling to cater to the sudden surge in demand. By itself, masks are relatively uncomplicated. These N95 masks are relatively uncomplicated to produce, but the current scarcity hinges on the shortage of one specific component in the production chain, and that's melt blown, a type of plastic filament that acts as a filter. Close to all production of these filaments have been offshored to China, resulting in a highly localized concentration of production. As mentioned, tightly integrated supply chains are highly interdependent. Every step presupposes the other, and the losses of stoppage in production, for instance due to viral contagion, spread rapidly across economic landscapes. If an essential preliminary product cannot be supplied, production processes elsewhere come to a standstill. And to make matters worse, the individual components of a supplier are often extremely specialized and tailored to the next step in production. The specialization led to global commodity chains often relying on very few leading suppliers, leaving only a small number of alternative sources, if any, to turn to. The vulnerabilities exposed by the current shortage of N95 masks are not exclusive to the current condition. They are innate to the protocol of just-in-time capitalism, whose underlying rationale seeks to exploit global wage disparities and avoid large-scale warehousing at all cost. Large inventories of medical necessities, as well as keeping a good share of the product off the market, could have ensured that essential workers are adequately equipped, which goes, however, against the predicaments of free market orthodoxy. In the midst of just-in-time economics, the virus spread rapidly. Among others, the author of the article Social Contagion, which was first published in Chuang, a journal focusing on labor unrest and capitalist development in China, pointed out how the spread of the virus largely followed the trade routes of capital, indicating how the virus traveled through globally circulating goods, along trade routes, and through the bodies laboring along these commodity chains of planetary scale. The fact that infection maps indicate high rates of contagion in the global hubs of manufacturing and transportation suggests that the crisis is managed at the expense of an already vulnerable workforce that is ordered to put their health at risk to keep commodity flows in steady circulation. So the outbreak of the pandemic has had obviously quite significant ripple effects in the realm of the economy, as we're facing an impending recession of historic proportions, as we're repeatedly being told. And as governments have moved to address this, we are witnessing two kinds of political trajectories emerge, and for one, that's strong state interventionism by way of large pro-business subsidies. While it is true that states have responded in different ways to the pandemic, we can still detect an overwhelming desire to turn to a pre-corona normality. In order to address economic downturn, governmental institutions in the EU and the US have been pressured to undertake measures that are at odds with the neoliberal script and mobilized huge sums to stabilize the economy in short amounts of time. It is beyond dispute that the trust in the self-regulating abilities of neoliberal economies is tumbling, and yet the measures undertaken by governments are largely not directed at a restructuring of our current economic order, but rather follow the approach of reinstituting that order through massive state subsidies. There's a very strong class bias that permeates these economic and fiscal policies, as the interests of large companies are systemically favored by these pro-business stimulus packages, while the interests of labor are falling far behind and are actually targeted by the easing of labor regulations to keep workers on the job. In an attempt to keep a crumbling economy afloat, the German government has, for instance, installed a credit program, the Wirtschaftsstabilisierungsfonds, which offers around 600 billion euros of financial support to large firms. And on top of that, the KfW, the Kreditanstalt für Wiederaufbau, that's a state-owned development bank, offers cheap, low-interest loans to big firms. Similarly, the Kurzarbeitergeld, presented as a measure to compensate wage losses for workers, in fact allows corporate actors to pass on some or all wage payments onto the state and also relieves them from the payment of social security provisions. So while capital is heavily subsidized, labor, on the other hand, is confronted with wage cuts, which has especially detrimental effects for low-income workers who may struggle to make a living with the losses under the Kurzarbeitergeld. Meanwhile, in the US, the government swiftly passed an economic stimulus measure, the Coronavirus Aid Relief and Economic Security Act, or CARES Act, of around $2 trillion, to this day one of the largest stimulus packages, which Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, one of the few to criticize the bill in Congress, described as the largest corporate bailout in history. At the other end of the spectrum, we are seeing an easing of labor regulations. We've seen this, for instance, in Germany, where regulations were being temporarily loosened when Labor Minister Hubertus Heil signed an agreement to extend workdays to a 12-hour maximum while shortening legally stipulated rest times. Or in the US, the FMCSA issued an emergency regulation which stated that they would provide hours of service regulatory relief to commercial vehicle drivers, which simply translates into longer working hours for truckers. What these examples demonstrate is the uneven and asymmetrical distribution of state funds and a strong bias towards business, as we have so far not seen the same efforts undertaken to provide, for instance, strong union representation for the workers that have proven to be so essential to keep society running, and we've also seen far fewer efforts to replace the wages lost by workers due to layoffs or unemployment. The majority of these policies have already been disproportionately beneficial for large corporate actors who are granted easy access to huge sums of state subsidies and low-interest state loans. Large firms are therefore likely to emerge either unharmed or even stronger from the currently unfolding crisis, exacerbating the already monopolistic tendencies of the current corporate landscape. The second strategy that has emerged is an increased reliance on private actors. Companies that deliver goods right to consumers' doorsteps are in high demand during times of self-isolation. Their appeal, however, also speaks to how seamlessly and how firmly these companies have integrated and installed themselves into the infrastructures of our everyday lives. Where state-owned public infrastructures are failing as a consequence of decades of financial depletion, private actors are seizing opportunity to fill this void. As of March, in the UK, the food delivery platforms have been in conversation with government officials about providing food delivery services for the elderly or immunocompromised. In the US, rideshare companies have expanded their services and are now delivering medical supplies to consumers, and Amazon basically functions as a central infrastructure for the delivery of essential goods. As of April, the government of Canada signed an agreement to partner up with Amazon to manage the logistics of distributing and delivering medical necessities to healthcare providers and making use of the company's sprawling distribution network. Governments are here turning to tech companies rather than investing in public infrastructure and public services, which would in the long run also ensure that countries would be better prepared for potential future disruptions like this. And it would also prove to be more beneficial to low-income households, which are currently hit the hardest. What this demonstrates is not necessarily corporations assisting in the management of the current crisis, but it is rather the latest extractive and capital-driven intrusion into the infrastructures that govern social life. It is a testimony to the devastating effects of decades of neoliberal austerity, the restructuring of public welfare according to the logics of market efficiency, deregulations in the realm of labor, and privatization efforts in infrastructure. It also testifies to the infrastructural power that companies like Amazon exercise, which is a more subtle but nonetheless potent form of corporate power, as its foundational quality, as an element of necessity and therefore dependency to it. Historically speaking, critical infrastructures which served the common good were put into public ownership as they were prone to monopolization and economies of scale. Control of private actors was deemed too risky, and they were therefore relegated to be governed by the state to keep them out of the hands of private interest, which has, however, slowly crept back into these spheres in the past decades. A tech behemoth with the kind of infrastructural power of the likes of Amazon is going to be difficult to contain. Among others, urbanist Paris Marx suggested, therefore, to nationalize Amazon, transferring the company into public ownership if it continues to fashion itself as a public utility. In a similar guise, Nick Cernicek had proposed the nationalization of its cloud computing network to ensure that critical digital infrastructures are put under democratic control. Suggestions like this would not only better the conditions of workers and curb the monopolistic power of an actor like Amazon, they would also prove more feasible than attempting to rebuild a comparable public infrastructure like this rapidly. While policies like these are currently not on the horizon, they demonstrate that it's going to require a great deal of imaginative political thinking and a significant paradigmatic shift in our socio-economic script. The outbreak of COVID-19 has shown how the competitive advantage of capital derived from the application of time-space compressing logistical techniques and its relentlessly cost-saving calculus has created a new nexus of vulnerabilities across the globe. The pandemic has exposed the dangers of transferring vital infrastructures that produce essential goods and put them into circulation into the hands of private for-profit actors, and it has also drawn attention to the significance of the labor necessary to keep these infrastructures running. The current insufficiencies of globally dispersed supply chains expose how neoliberal governance and private corporations alike prioritize profits over public health, foregoing the stockpiling of medical supplies as the dictate of lucrative just-in-time production and just-in-time logistics took hold. This should be a plea to treat critical infrastructures as a public good that needs to be financed adequately, and taking measures towards this end would be a first step towards an economic reorganization that ensures that the sectors that provide essential services are not put into the hands of the market that fails to adequately manage their provision in times of crisis. Nationalization of parts of the economy is, however, not enough, and there's a necessity to push the discussion further to also consider the democratization of key industries. A strong state alone won't aid the current crisis. Neoliberalism has, after all, always relied on strong state intervention. To broaden the scope of political possibilities discussed, we should therefore consider the democratizing prospects of collective ownership models such as cooperatives, which provide workers with the possibility to democratically organize production. In today's pandemic, workers provide oftentimes essential services, helping the public to maintain social distancing. This begs the question why this is not the hour of labor. The warehouse workers and delivery workers that are enabling a large part of the population to self-isolate in the comfort of their own homes are not seeing any of the profits of the increased demand of their labor. We have seen an upsurge of strikes and labor action in the past weeks, although mostly targeted at corporations and competent handling of the pandemic, as workers often had no access to basic workplace safety measures. The past weeks should have made explicitly clear that no matter how technologically advanced an economy, the production of goods, the delivery of services, and the movement of resources are realized by the hands of human labor. It is the essential backbone of the economy. Despite the specter of automation, capital still proves to be dependent on that labor, and the insistence on the opposite might rather be an attestation as to how effectively capitalist abstraction obscures the labor involved in the movement and distribution of resources. From this vantage point, calls for international solidarity among workers are bestowed a heightened actuality, as labor will have to tackle the near impossible seeming task of vertically organizing workers along global commodity chains. Thank you.
two questions, and you can repeat them before you answer them. The first one is why we've seen more, or why we've seen so little in Germany in terms of like reactions or worker organization in relation to the states, or just like talking about that a little bit seems like an interesting point to continue.
Okay, so there was one question geared towards why we've seen less labor action in Germany than we have elsewhere. I mean, I don't have a definite answer to this, but I do think that there is, for one, this dynamic where the narrative currently is that Germany has been handling this very well, because people just look sort of like at the statistics, and then in comparison to other European neighboring countries or the States or elsewhere, it appears as though the German government has been handling this crisis fairly well. So I think that adds to this aspect why there is sort of less pushback than we've seen elsewhere. Yeah, so I think that might be an aspect, and I think that's actually also showing how dangerous it is to kind of also speak about the effects of the spread of this pandemic only in kind of like statistical terms, because while if you look at these statistics, it might appear as though the German government is handling this very well, but I still think it's really important to like humanize these numbers and humanize like the losses we have been seeing in the past weeks, and still ask the same questions. You can still ask them in Germany as well, like why has there been this decade of just like privatization in the healthcare sector that is true here as well. And I actually think that it's kind of disappointing that, for instance, on the governmental level, there has been so little pushback from the left also pointing this out. Yeah.
Second question is surrounding vertical organization, and if you wanna, what does that mean in terms of maybe exploring that a little bit more, that concept, and why that's important. Was the second question.
Okay.
Maybe how that could look in one specific industry, maybe, or what, like making that concept tangible somehow.
Okay, so the second question is about vertical organization and what exactly that means and why it's so important. So I think this concept is so important because it really cuts kind of to the heart of what was so devastating about this revolution in logistics, because it's really been two things. It's been, yes, these progresses in technology that have made transport more easy and have made transport quicker, but at the same time, this is only profitable and it's only lucrative because there have been such massive deregulations in labor law, because those deregulations then are what make the organization of production and distribution, this form of organization, so lucrative because it's so cheap, and that's just due to labor deregulation. And so I think the strength of vertical organization is that it really links up both of these problem fields. And it's also, I think, a way to think beyond sort of like nationalized answers towards this problem, because this has been another kind of response. If, for example, you look at how the current US government has responded to this, their perspective is towards a kind of like xenophobic protectionism, where it's just about protecting or fighting for workers that happen to be within the confinements of like some national boundary or border. And so vertical organization actually cuts across these national borders, and it's about really establishing some form of international solidarity along these commodity chains, and to understand that it's really these nodes of circulation that have hit this industry so incredibly hard.
There's one question more. How can we vertically organize when under COVID era restrictions, national borders are more strict than ever?
Okay, so the next question is about how we can vertically organize during COVID. And I honestly don't have the answer to this. I do think that technology does offer some possibilities here because it does allow people to organize without having to be physically close to each other. But then still at the same time, I think every form of like strike action or labor action has to actually happen outside and in within the context that you're working on. So I think then maybe we should rather use this time to work on strategies for when we can go outside again, and obviously stop supporting any of the corporations that are really like reaping massive profits out of just like a big crisis.
There are two more questions. And can you, so the first one is how can you describe how tangibly vertical organization might work? And secondly is why it's called vertical.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the next question is about how vertical organization could practically look like, tangible. So this is a really complicated one because, and this was something I was trying to also get at during the talk, is that the challenges, the contextual challenges to do this are really, really immense. And that's for one, the fact that the staff, people that come together, there's such a high turnover rate among people. So it's really, really hard to just do something that is kind of like a given in other forms of organizing. And the other problem really is that these labor regulations have been so eroded. So I think the first thing you really need to do is to establish a unionization structure that is robust enough so you can tackle this in the first place, and to have labor regulations and laws in place that protect you. An example, I think, where this has sort of worked recently was in France, where a union brought forth a court order to close one of the distribution centers of Amazon in France, but only, and I think this just shows like how you need like massive pushback for also the level of kind of the judiciary to react in your favor. And so I think this is still going to need like some practical thinking through of how to actually tackle this, because it's not only people on the left, of course, that have pointed out that there is such a potential in vertical organization. Management has very much recognized this as well, and so this also makes workers that are employed in this field especially like a special target for forms of repression. And so I think these are all contextual challenges that do really make this difficult. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to do it anyways, but it's incredibly hard.
Okay, there's more questions. Nick asks, how could inshoring affect these issues? Do you see a rise in inshoring happening as a result of the pandemic?
How could I see what?
A rise in inshoring. I don't know. Inshore, like I-N-S-H. Inshore. Like shoreline. I don't know what it means by that. Ask Nick to elaborate.
Okay. There's a question from Nick about inshoring, and I'm not quite sure if I understand what exactly you're getting at, so maybe you can just elaborate a little bit on it, and then we're gonna get back to it.
The opposite of offshoring.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think this is a tricky one, because on the one hand, I do think that, of course, for like workers domestically, then inshoring or reshoring or like kind of like localizing production a bit more is good for workers. And it's also, I think, for some resources necessary. There's really no need, and it's also just irrational to produce essential goods so globally dispersed as we're doing right now. And also for food production, this should be organized more regionally. But I think when we argue in favor of inshoring or reshoring, we have to connect that to a political agenda that also addresses the international dimension of this, and to make sure that it's not just about kind of fighting for better conditions for workers that are based in formerly industrialized zones, but to connect that to the conditions of workers elsewhere that might then be negatively affected by inshoring or reshoring. And so that you kind of connect that to the political demand to better conditions internationally. I don't know, like set globally binding minimum wages, for example, or just set stronger labor regulations internationally. And so I think it's important to connect these two. But I do think that there's potential there. Yeah.
There's one more question about how the kind of idea of vertical organization can be hijacked or has been hijacked by corporations to evade physical jurisdiction and labor regulations.
Mm-hmm.
And what do you think about that, or if there's any thoughts on that?
So the next question is about how corporations have kind of hijacked the idea of vertical organization, if I've understood it correctly. And I mean, I think they haven't hijacked that. They have always, or they have for a very long time, operated kind of in a similar way. So you have globalizations kind of operate and organize internationally, and then labor doesn't do that. And I think they have hijacked that in a way, or I don't really think hijacked maybe is the right word, because I think it's actually not a side effect. It's precisely the point. This mobility that capital has now to just kind of circumvent spaces of struggle. So if you're producing in a certain region and then there's a lot of pushback from labor, and you don't want to deal with this because then the wages are rising and there's like more regulation, capital can simply move elsewhere and just completely bypass that struggle. And so I think there's not only the potential that business will do that, it's already doing that, and it has done that. And that's one of the reasons why logistical techniques are implemented in the first place. Yeah.
I think that's all the questions.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you. I'll stop the stream now.
Yep.